Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. And the flight arrived on time, but we couldn't make it come earlier, so I apologize for being a few minutes late and missing President Prody's introduction. But I was happy to hear most of Nicholas's wonderful remarks. I think a starting point is that the role of information and communication technology for sustainable development is very well recognized. So we're not in an uphill struggle. The Agenda 2030, which is the operative guidance for all nations on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, amply discusses information technology. And probably the most important single reference is in Goal 9.C, which may have been mentioned already, which says to significantly increase access to information and communications technology and strive to provide universal and affordable access to the internet in least developed countries by 2020. So there is already a strong mandate for universal access. And when one goes through each of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, technology is mentioned in almost every one, and information technology is mentioned in several of them. In the education goal, SDG 4, there's a special mandate for assisting in the training and education and information and communication technology. In the SDG 5 on gender equality, there's a specific mention about the role of information and communication technology in promoting gender equality. In SDG 7, there's a specific mention for energy infrastructure. And there is a general mandate also in SDG 17, which is to enhance, fully operationalize the technology bank and science, technology and innovation capacity building mechanism for least developed countries, and enhance the use of enabling technology, in particular information and communication technology. So this is a good start. This means that the importance of broadband access, mobile technologies, and information and communications technologies generally, I think, is well appreciated. The Broadband Commission is a commission of the United Nations led by two of the agencies, the International Telecommunications Union and UNESCO, and the Broadband Commission has been meeting for several years. Nicholas and I are at most of the meetings, and that commission is specifically charged with mobilizing broadband for sustainable development. So that's the purpose of the Broadband Commission. And it has been, I think, a useful exercise, but again, it shows the high level of recognition that we're in an information age, and if people around the world are to be prosperous, safe, and active citizens, they need to be part of the modern information and communications technologies. That, I think, means that the notion that this is a basic human right is within reach, certainly. And indeed, I'm not sure about all of the human rights protocols because I haven't had time to check them to what extent that reference is already made, but I don't think that it's a difficult argument in practice given this very wide recognition within the UN system that we're talking about something that is quite fundamental. The second point that I would make along these same lines is that the role of information and communications technology in every important sector of the economy is evident. So this is what in economic development we call a general purpose technology, which means that it is so central to economic life that it pervades every sector of the economy. And there are not very many general purpose technologies. Steam engine was one. Another was electrification. And I would put internet, broadband, and digitization in general certainly as a third on equal par with those others, actually. So in our own development experience, for example, the work that Sonia and I are engaged in healthcare delivery in low-income settings, it's all based on access to information technology. Smartphones in the hands of community health workers is essential. Telemedicine is essential. Teledentistry is essential. Increasingly, remote diagnostics, remote imaging, remote reading of X-ray images maybe halfway around the world. New portable imaging equipment like sonograms and other equipment for safe pregnancy are also pervasive now. Similarly, in education, Nicholas showed us the picture of the children teaching each other. We have a mandate for quality pre-K through universal secondary education. I would make the claim that this will be impossible without very active use of broadband to extend the curriculum, to train teachers, to connect classrooms, to help monitor schools, to help manage school systems, and so on. A third area is agriculture, where the productivity of agriculture increasingly is precision agriculture based on very high-resolution GPS applications of fertilizer, seed, machinery, water management, and so forth. In the area of jobs, which is SDG 8, there's no question that information technology literacy is a sine qua non for being able to be an effective member of the labor force now. And many schools around the world, for instance in New York City, now teach coding as a basic idea so that people can understand the world that they're in and that they also hope to get a job after. I would say information and communications technology is essential for good governance because almost every quality governance system right now, for example, payments of bills, collection of taxes, transparency of procurement, and very importantly, individual identity, which is crucial for legal standing, is now an online phenomenon. And India's lead in the Aadhaar biometric online ID, I think, is very notable and inspiring, and the African nations are all clamoring for India to come help to extend this online unique identification using biometrics to the African context. For ecological conservation, ICT is essential, especially for remote sensing, for interpretation of daily satellite images to track illegal fishing, to track illegal deforestation, to track forest fires, and so forth. ICTs are vital in the so-called Internet of Things, which will connect devices to enable energy efficiency, smart grids, smart transport, sustainable cities, high introduction of renewable energy. So all of the decarbonization cannot be done otherwise. And we know now that information technology is central for finance because places that never have had and never will have a physical bank are engaged in online banking and payment services, and physical cash may disappear soon, and it already is disappearing in places like Sweden, where cash payments are not accepted increasingly, and one has to pay actually through online payments. So all of this suggests that the spirit of the discussion, that this is a basic feature of being part of the present-day economy and achieving sustainable development, is not only correct but absolutely pervasive. Third point that I would make is for the importance of defining what access means. Access could mean that you can buy a data package, that there's physical coverage in your area. Access could mean that you have a data package that you can afford for most families. Access probably should mean something much, much deeper than that, and that is access to the services of information technology in all of the areas that I mentioned, which raises the question of who writes the code, who provides the services, how they're actually implemented, what does it mean to have access if applications have not been prepared for places that need them. What is the difference of physical and software access? They're obviously closely intertwined and not even so clearly able to be delineated. A fourth point that I think we need to discuss is all of the downsides, because everything I've mentioned is all of the upsides. But the downsides of this category of technology are as big potentially as the upsides in some ways. Like all technology, we have learned throughout history that every technology has its positive side and every technology has its negative side, and we're just beginning to understand some of the negatives. The US election may well have been determined by cybercrimes. This is not a myth or propaganda. It's quite clear that there was very deep meddling by Russia in some way, in very sophisticated ways in the campaign. The margin of victory of President Trump was so small that it's absolutely plausible that this tipped the election. That's rather shocking, actually. The U.S. defenses proved to be pitiful, useless, actually, in a lot of ways. The incumbent president didn't know what to do. He didn't want to interfere. He said very little, and the outcomes were no doubt in some measure swayed. Identity theft is completely pervasive now, with millions and millions of cases of identity theft and possibly hundreds of millions of invasions in the United States or in Yahoo accounts being breached. There's a whole dark internet, which I hadn't really appreciated until reading an article on the way over on the plane last night, that by some estimates, dark internet is as high a proportion of the internet as dark matter and dark energy are of the universe. In other words, that there could be 80 or 90% of the material online that is not picked up, for example, in a Google search, because I guess HTML or the other indicators are turned off, and therefore there's a whole pervasive and often criminal side that is quite massive. There's a profound question of individual privacy in every way, both in use of big data and in the way that Google and Amazon and Facebook and the other major portals use all of our information and know far more about us than we know about ourselves. And you find that every few weeks when your credit card company calls you and said, "Did you really make such and such purchase?" And you say, "No, I didn't." Yeah, we didn't think so. Well, they know a lot about your purchase habits, and so all of this is in routines and information that we don't even, I certainly don't understand at all. What is really being culled and how it's being used, but it is pretty deep information about me that's widely available that I gave approval when I clicked I agree, but I don't know about you, but I never read any text that went along with I agree, and if I didn't agree, I wouldn't have any idea what to do anyway. Then there's the question of government surveillance, which is obviously pervasive and very dangerous. There is the question of monopoly of key services. We have a few giants that are mega rich, mega holding our data, out of control, and we have the gentleman to my right knows what they're doing. I don't know what they're doing, and very few people understand what they're doing. There is the downside of automation, which is a whole other subject, which is really going to change the labor market decisively. I just mentioned that. That's not the same issue as ours, but it actually is related. And again, I was just reading a news story on the ride in from the airport where now there are, in the e-commerce applications, a business in China is now running 40 stores, all automated stores with 4 employees online. So you go into the shop, there's no one there, everything is barcoded, everything is scanned, everything is e-payments, and if you have any question, you have a video contact with somebody that can help you, and there are 4 people running 40 shops right now. And the retail sector is one of the biggest employment sectors in the world. It's about to be profoundly transformed. There is the question, again, much debated, of superintelligence and robotics that gets out of control, and cyber warfare, or drones and automated systems and so forth. So I mention all of this because it would be hard to talk about human rights in this sector without talking about the risks and acknowledging them and having the question of protection. Then finally, let me mention what would such a doctrine imply, because rights require remedies and they require obligations to be fulfilled. So whose obligations are we speaking about, and how would those rights be realized over time? Part of it is national policies, questions of coverage. And yesterday I was in a political meeting in the United States of state legislators from across the United States, and a state legislator from Wisconsin raised her hand and said, why don't we have a right to internet here? I have rural constituents that are no longer part of our economic process, and this was the United States. So both it shows the merit, but it also asks the question, who is responsible? I wasn't sure that I agreed with Nicholas's comment about auctioning spectrum in one major way, which is that those who have access to spectrum, of course it may be the flip side of what you're saying, tend to make a lot of money on their access to spectrum, and the auction is a way to capture that income, and it could be used for access. So you can create a public access fund by auctioning spectrum and then dedicating it to making sure that the marginal parts of the society are well represented. I think your model is that spectrum should only be used for not-for-profit purposes, but it seems like a hard stretch, actually, and rather than only going that way, capturing the value of the public's ownership of spectrum through auctions probably makes some sense. But there also are, in almost all countries, universal service and access funds in which telecoms pay a small percentage, maybe 1%, and that's supposed to go for a pool for universal access. Maybe we should revisit the discussion about the efficacy, size of payments, and usefulness of those funds. And then on the international side, there are obviously many questions that arise. What is the responsibility of the major IT companies? We have giants like Apple, Amazon, Google, Alibaba, Microsoft, Facebook. What responsibilities do they have to this? I once went to Facebook and said, you should do a lot more on education. They said, no, we're a business. If you're interested, go to Washington. And I said to them, I'll go to Washington when you pay your taxes. And then they threw me out of the office. But this is a real question about what is responsibility. It's interesting, Amazon has been done with a payment of 13 billion euros to Ireland that the EU is requiring that the EU is requiring that Ireland collect. Ireland says, we don't want this. We're a tax haven. We don't want to collect from Apple. The Commission is saying you have to collect from Apple. One idea is that we go from this meeting to the government of Ireland and say, please collect and put the 13 billion into a fund for universal access, because maybe that way they can keep their tax haven and we can have our access too. So if there's creativity in how the funding actually is used, I think we can make some headway. On the organizational side, my own instinct would be, if we are able to muster support for this proposal, to make the ITU be responsible for this. We have an international organization. It is loosely charged with this. It basically is right now charged with telecommunications. This is the telecommunications of the 21st century. Rather than having an internecine war with the UN, where you always lose, by the way, because incumbent organizations always win, rather task an existing organization with the charge of helping to oversee and enforce a new human right. The last point I would make is, if we go forward, I think it would be very much worth having a discussion with the President of the General Assembly, which I'd be happy to do. I have been asked by him during his one-year tenure to serve also on his advisory committee, and I'll meet with him in mid-October, and it's an issue that I could raise with him. Thank you.